Welcome to our deep dive into the entire history of the United States of America. From the ancient lands of Native American tribes to the modern global superpower, the story of the U.S. is filled with courage, conflict, innovation, and change. Buckle up as we embark on a journey across centuries, revolutions, and social transformations. This video will take you through over 500 years of complex, often contradictory, but always compelling history. We'll not just cover dates and events, we'll explore the philosophies, cultural shifts, economic transitions, and social revolutions that have shaped this diverse nation. Let's begin. Before European colonization, North America was a vibrant patchwork of Native American nations, each with its own governance, spiritual systems, trade routes, and customs. From the Arctic Inuit to the Southeast's Cherokee, the Plains Lakota, and the Pacific Northwest's Chinook, tribal cultures were diverse and dynamic. Mound-building cultures such as the Mississippians constructed monumental earthworks and engaged in long-distance trade. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, was a thriving metropolis with an estimated population of 20,000 in the 12th century, larger than London at the time. The ancestral Puebloans built multi-story stone complexes in places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. Their knowledge of astronomy and engineering is still admired today. Meanwhile, the Iroquois Confederacy formed a sophisticated system of governance that some historians believe influenced the U.S. Constitution. Tribal economies ranged from nomadic hunting and gathering to agriculture and fishing. Languages, myths, and social hierarchies varied widely, but common threads included a deep respect for nature, strong kinship bonds, and oral traditions that preserved centuries of knowledge. Contact between tribes was frequent, facilitated by trade networks like the Hopewell Exchange System, which linked the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Goods such as obsidian, copper, shells, and flint were exchanged over thousands of miles. European colonization would disrupt these societies catastrophically, but for thousands of years, these indigenous cultures thrived, innovating, adapting, and flourishing in diverse ecological zones. The Age of Exploration brought seismic change to the Americas, motivated by the 3 Gs: God, Gold, and Glory. European powers began expeditions across the Atlantic. While Christopher Columbus never set foot in what would become the United States, his voyages in 1492 opened the floodgates of European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. Spain established the earliest permanent European settlement in what is now the U.S., with St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. The Spanish Empire, focused on conquest and conversion, built missions across the Southwest and California. Catholic friars spread Christianity, while conquistadors sought wealth, often exploiting or massacring indigenous populations. The French explored and claimed the Mississippi Valley and Great Lakes regions, building relationships with native tribes primarily through fur trading. Cities like Detroit, St. Louis, and New Orleans began as French colonial outposts. French colonization often involved smaller settlements and more reliance on indigenous alliances. The Dutch settled along the Hudson River, founding New Amsterdam, later renamed New York when the British seized it. Their colony emphasized trade and religious tolerance, attracting a mix of Europeans and becoming an early model for pluralism. However, it was the British who left the most lasting imprint. The 1607 founding of Jamestown, Virginia, marked the first permanent English colony. It faced severe struggles: starvation, disease, and clashes with the Powhatan Confederacy, but eventually thrived thanks to tobacco cultivation. In 1620, the Pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower, establishing Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. Unlike Jamestown's economic focus, these settlers sought religious freedom. Their Mayflower Compact was a pioneering document in self-governance. Over time, 13 British colonies were established along the East Coast. Each had distinct characteristics. The New England colonies were Puritan-dominated, emphasizing education and tight-knit communities. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, were diverse, religiously tolerant, and agriculturally productive. The southern colonies relied heavily on plantation agriculture, with enslaved Africans providing the labor backbone for crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Colonial life was harsh and hierarchical. Disease, malnutrition, and frontier warfare were common. Women had few rights, and class divisions were stark. Yet these early settlements laid the groundwork for American identity, a blend of European heritage, frontier adaptability, and emerging democratic ideals. As populations grew, so did tensions, with indigenous nations, among colonists, and with European rivals. Land disputes and religious divisions were common, and competition for control of North America between Britain, France, and Spain led to a series of colonial wars. By the mid-18th century, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was becoming strained. The Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that emphasized reason, liberty, and individual rights, inspired many colonists to question the legitimacy of monarchy and hereditary rule. Thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu influenced colonial leaders, planting the seeds of a revolution. Tensions began with the aftermath of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, a costly conflict that left Britain in debt. To recoup expenses, Parliament imposed a series of taxes on the colonies: the Sugar Act, 1764, the Stamp Act, 1765, and the Townshend Acts, 1767. These acts sparked outrage as colonists insisted on no taxation without representation. Protests spread. The Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, organized resistance. Pamphlets such as Thomas Paine's Common Sense, 1776, galvanized public support for independence. Tensions escalated with events like the Boston Massacre, 1770, and the Boston Tea Party, 1773. In 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, representing a unified colonial voice for the first time. When British troops attempted to seize colonial weapons in Lexington and Concord in April 1775, armed conflict began. The American Revolutionary War had officially started. In July 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson. It declared the colonies free and independent states, and outlined the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The war lasted until 1783. Despite early losses, key victories at Saratoga and Yorktown, supported by French military aid, turned the tide. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the conflict and recognized American independence. Yet, independence was only the beginning. The next chapter of American history would involve the difficult task of building a functioning, unified nation. In the immediate aftermath of the Revolution, the fledgling United States faced enormous challenges. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, created a weak central government with little power to tax, regulate commerce, or enforce laws. Domestic unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786, a revolt by farmers in Massachusetts protesting high taxes and debt, highlighted the need for a stronger federal government. This led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Delegates including George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. After months of debate, they produced a framework that balanced power between states and the federal government, and between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president in 1791. The 1790s saw the emergence of political parties: Federalists, who supported a strong central government, and were led by Hamilton, and Democratic Republicans, who favored states' rights and were led by Thomas Jefferson. Foreign policy remained volatile. The U.S. tried to remain neutral in European conflicts, but was often pulled into disputes. At home, the government established the National Bank, set up federal courts, and laid the foundations for future economic growth. This era saw the creation of many institutions that continue to define American governance today. However, debates over power, representation, and the future of slavery were far from resolved. The early 19th century was marked by territorial expansion and increasing tensions over slavery and regional identity. In 1803, President Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the United States. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804-1806, mapped the new land and established relations with indigenous peoples. The War of 1812, often called America's Second War of Independence, was fought against Britain over maritime rights and frontier conflicts. It ended in a stalemate, but boosted national pride and solidified U.S. sovereignty. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, warned European powers to stay out of the Americas, asserting U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, internal development flourished. Canals, railroads, and factories transformed the economy. However, this period also saw the forced removal of Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act, 1830, led to the Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee died during relocation to Oklahoma. The expansion reignited debates over slavery. The Missouri Compromise, 1820, temporarily balanced slave and free states, but tensions continued to grow. The 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln triggered the secession of Southern states, who formed the Confederate States of America. The Civil War began in April 1861 with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. The war would last 4 bloody years and result in over 600,000 deaths. Major battles included Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. The Union had industrial and manpower advantages, while the Confederacy relied on strong military leadership and home terrain. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, redefined the war as a fight not just for Union, but also for freedom. In 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, ending the war. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, attempted to rebuild the South and integrate freed slaves into American life. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and secured voting rights. However, resistance was fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged. Black codes restricted African American freedom. Federal troops were eventually withdrawn, and Jim Crow laws institutionalized segregation for decades. Despite its shortcomings, Reconstruction marked a bold attempt to build a more equitable society. Its legacy continues to shape debates about civil rights and racial justice in America. After the Civil War, the United States entered an era of rapid industrialization, often referred to as the Gilded Age, roughly 1870 to 1900. Named by Mark Twain to reflect a glittering surface masking deep inequality, the era saw unprecedented economic growth and staggering wealth disparity. The rise of industrial giants, Andrew Carnegie, steel; John D. Rockefeller, oil; J.P. Morgan, banking; and Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroads, transformed the U.S. into the world's leading industrial power. Cities exploded in population. Millions of immigrants from Europe arrived, providing labor for factories and reshaping urban America. Yet working conditions were brutal. Child labor was common, hours were long, and wages were low. Tenement housing was overcrowded and sanitation was poor. Labor unrest grew, marked by events like the Haymarket Riot, 1886, the Homestead Strike, 1892, and the Pullman Strike, 1894. The Progressive Era, 1890s-1920s, emerged in response. Reformers sought to curb corporate power, improve working conditions, protect consumers, and expand democracy. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed corruption. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle led to food safety reforms. Women, led by figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, fought for suffrage. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. World War I broke out in 1914, but the U.S. initially remained neutral. German U-boat attacks and the Zimmermann telegram pushed America to declare war in 1917. U.S. troops helped tip the balance in favor of the Allies. After the war, Wilson promoted the League of Nations, but the U.S. Senate rejected membership, marking a return to isolationism. The 1920s were a time of economic boom and cultural transformation. The Roaring Twenties, jazz, flappers, and mass consumerism flourished. But nativism also surged, and the Ku Klux Klan regained strength. The 1929 stock market crash triggered the Great Depression. Unemployment soared, banks failed, and millions were plunged into poverty. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Agencies like the WPA, CCC, and Social Security reshaped the federal government's role in American life. World War II began in 1939. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. entered the war. The conflict mobilized the economy and brought full employment. Women entered the workforce in large numbers. The U.S. fought in Europe and the Pacific, culminating in the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Victory in World War II established the U.S. as a global superpower, but also ushered in the nuclear age and a new geopolitical struggle. The Cold War, 1947 to 1991, was a global ideological struggle between the capitalist United States and communist Soviet Union. It shaped foreign and domestic policy for over 4 decades. Domestically, the Red Scare and McCarthyism stoked fears of communist infiltration. Internationally, the U.S. adopted a strategy of containment. This led to proxy wars: Korean War, 1950–1953, Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The space race began after the USSR launched Sputnik in 1957. The U.S. responded with NASA and, in 1969, landed the first humans on the moon. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Détente in the 1970s eased tensions, but didn't end the rivalry. The Cold War also drove massive defense spending and alliances like NATO. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War. The U.S. stood alone as the world's dominant superpower. The mid-20th century saw transformative movements for equality and justice. The Civil Rights Movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and others, challenged segregation and racial injustice. Landmark moments included Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, Montgomery Bus Boycott, 1955–1956, March on Washington, 1963, Civil Rights Act, 1964, Voting Rights Act, 1965. Simultaneously, second-wave feminism, the LGBTQ+ rights movement, the American Indian movement, and environmental activism reshaped cultural norms. The counterculture of the 1960s opposed the Vietnam War, materialism, and traditional authority. Despite progress, backlash was strong. The assassinations of MLK and RFK in 1968 symbolized the volatility of the era. America emerged from the 60s and 70s transformed but deeply divided. The 1980s, under Ronald Reagan, marked a conservative turn. Tax cuts, deregulation, and a renewed Cold War stance. The economy grew, but inequality widened. Social issues like the war on drugs and the AIDS crisis revealed deep societal fractures. The 1990s saw the rise of the internet and globalization. Bill Clinton presided over economic growth, NAFTA, welfare reform, and impeachment proceedings. The 2000 election ended in controversy, and the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001 reshaped U.S. foreign and domestic policy. The war on terror led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, expanded surveillance, and deepened political polarization. The 2008 financial crisis triggered the Great Recession. Barack Obama's presidency brought healthcare reform and symbolized racial progress, but also ignited fierce opposition. Donald Trump's 2016 victory signaled a populist wave. His presidency was marked by trade wars, immigration battles, impeachment, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Joe Biden took office in 2021 amid ongoing cultural and political tension, economic uncertainty, and global instability. America today faces immense challenges and opportunities. Climate change and energy transition, technological innovation, AI, automation, space travel, polarized politics and misinformation, demographic shifts and immigration, global competition, especially with China, movements for racial justice, gender equality, and environmental sustainability continue to evolve. Debates over the Constitution, gun rights, healthcare, and education remain central. Yet despite deep divisions, the U.S. remains a leader in culture, science, and innovation. Its story is still being written, shaped by generations striving to fulfill the nation's founding promises. The history of the United States is a story of contradictions: freedom and oppression, expansion and resistance, unity and division. From indigenous civilizations to digital revolutions, it is a history marked by struggle and reinvention. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive journey through time. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please like, subscribe, and share. For more history content, stay tuned. This is the story of America, unfinished but forever unfolding.